You hate to see it happen. A game ascended to god-tier status with empty promises and illusions fed into our minds by dishonest developers and precisely calculated marketing, and unfortunately, it's something we're all used to now. That's not to say we should just let it slide. People have the right to be angry when devs don't keep their promises, and CD Projekt Red are no exception. I think with them though, it hurt people even more than usual. Like at this point, we know companies like EA, Activision and Bethesda are going to deliver broken, buggy and flawed video games. This time was different. For a lot of people, this time it felt like their kid who could do no wrong suddenly burnt their house down. It seemed like such an impossible task to screw up. A supposed 8-year development partnered with one of the most exciting and dedicated developers currently on the market. What could go wrong? Well, a lot, actually. The anticipation for Cyberpunk dates back to 2013, where CD Projekt Red revealed a short but impactful trailer depicting advanced tech that got a lot of people excited for the game. News after this was very little, and it wasn't until 2018 when we were surprised by another trailer for the game, this time focusing on the world building and showing us early versions of Jackie and V. This idea of a dystopian future filled with tech and body modification promised players that they could make their own destiny in the game, be who they wanted to be, claiming to throw linear storytelling out of the window. This was the trailer that got people well and truly invested into this Blade Runner-esque world CD Projekt Red were creating. Then of course came the 2019 trailer that I think even people who had never heard of the game prior, or even now, know about it thanks to that one beautiful man. This trailer aimed to tease what to expect in the narrative of Cyberpunk, and revealed that Keanu Reeves would play a part in said story. Obviously the internet went mental at this revelation, believing that nothing could go wrong now that Jesus himself was tied to this game.
He's waiting.
Hey!
Oh my gosh, I knew that Reeves doing in here! What? Holy shit!
Now typically when a game gets delayed, it lets the developers iron out issues like bugs or perhaps add more content with the new time frame. Most people, well, everyone, is in agreement that Cyberpunk 2077 needed more than a year to be finished. Cyberpunk had one of the worst launches in gaming history. God only knows how much worse it would have been if they stuck to the original release. Best not to think about it. This game for a lot of people was a huge letdown, especially those who bought it on last gen, God rest their souls. I fortunately played the game on PC, so launch, although was still pretty bad, wasn't as bad as it could have been. Saying that feels like I'm comparing a car crash to a plane crash. It didn't take long for CD Projekt Red to hold up their hands and admit that they had sold us an unfinished game. Now it's all well and good saying that, but it came a bit late. Luckily, the people who bought the game on consoles were able to refund their copy. This revelation that Cyberpunk did not hold up most of its promises came as quite a shock to a lot of people, and rightfully so. CD Projekt Red were known solely for the Witcher games, and The Witcher 3 in particular was a phenomenal game that had so much dedication put into it from the developer, so people expected Cyberpunk would be no different. I myself wasn't too excited by the game when it was announced. Truthfully, I didn't know much about the game's past and CD Projekt Red themselves. When it came close to the release, however, I began to feel the excitement and was intrigued by the world CD Projekt Red had shown us in those trailers. After the success Red Dead 2 garnered, I was all for single-player open-world games and pre-ordered the game a week before it came out. Despite the constant bombardment of glitches, bugs, and dropping frame rates, I loved Cyberpunk 2077. Now you might think I'm mad, but just hear me out. Despite the game's obvious flaws, it has a lot of brilliant qualities that drag you into the world of Night City. Sometimes it does feel like you're being pulled two different ways simultaneously, as one half of the game is trying to immerse you and the other is equally breaking you out of that experience. These issues didn't stop me from putting well over 100 hours into the game, which, saying out loud, is a bit embarrassing. Whilst most developers tend to leave terrible games to burn, it was nice to see CD Projekt Red actually work to fix the game, and over the past year have released numerous patches for the game to make it a much smoother experience. Although yes, there is still a long way to go as bugs still infest the game, Cyberpunk has made some great progress. I mean, my PC doesn't feel like it will combust whilst I'm playing anymore, so that's a plus. I understand why many people writ this game off at launch, but to me, there is a great game under all these problems. When thinking about what went wrong for CD Projekt Red, I think the issue stemmed from them being too ambitious and riding the excitement of fans too much, like what we saw with the case of No Man's Sky. Whilst the game does offer a lot of variety and has elements of player freedom and interactivity, it's nowhere near the level they promised. Everyone would have enjoyed this game a lot more if they were just a little more honest. I know, it's shocking. I feel bad for them in a way because there is so much to appreciate about this game, but they just got too greedy. But somewhere under all that mess, I feel there is a great game with a lot of deeper meanings and beliefs built within it. This video aims to discuss Cyberpunk in its current state a year later, and hopefully convince at least some of you that this game is worth your time. So wake the up, samurai. We've got a game to analyze. Also, there will be spoilers for the game in some places, so if you want to play it, maybe play it first, then watch my video. Or if you don't care, then just watch it anyway. Arguably the most polished and enjoyable part of Cyberpunk is the narrative. The story has some truly interesting plot points and character arcs that for the most part feel satisfying and keep you engaged on who the characters are, what it is exactly they do, and how they fit into this universe. Now, if you're one of those people who never gave Cyberpunk a chance, this may all be a little bit confusing, so I will give a brief explanation of the universe. The year is 2077. Earth has now become a dystopia as pollution and climate change have caused most of the wildlife on Earth to go extinct. As well as this, the human population has drastically decreased thanks to climate change and natural disasters, and now there aren't many cities left. Night City, where this game is set, is one of those last remaining cities in America. The city, in this sense, could be viewed as both a safe haven and a living hell, as although it is one of those last remaining cities providing some sort of shelter, the city itself is rampant with crime, poverty, and corruption. Technological advancements have allowed humans to upgrade themselves to increase attributes such as strength, speed, endurance, attractiveness, pretty much anything you can think of, and can merge themselves with technology thanks to things like smart links. Some individuals push the line between humanity and technology too far, to the point where they are more machine than flesh. The city has many factions within it, such as gangs and megacorporations, which act as both allies and enemies throughout the game. Cyberpunk takes a lot of inspiration from sci-fi and disaster movies, with the use of common tropes like evil corporations ruling over the common people, enhanced humans, hyperreal technology, and of course the dystopian setting, with the city acting as the only source of refuge. I'm sure we have all seen at least some of these conventions used in some of our favourite sci-fi films, but although not completely original in terms of concept or setting, Cyberpunk takes these things and makes something truly brilliant out of them. The story for the most part focuses on V, the character who you play as through the game, again for the most part, determining on which life path you chose at the beginning of the game. V is either a nomad, a street kid, or a corpo. Nomads are essentially found in large clans and travel from place to place, acting in the best interest of their family. Street kids are pretty self-explanatory, individuals who have grown up in Night City, who have had to fight to survive the harsh reality of growing up poor in an overpopulated and unfeeling city. Corpos are the people who work for large corporations, which in this case is Arasaka, the biggest leading power in Cyberpunk, whose lack of empathy and ruthlessness knows no bounds. Corpos are sly and know only to look out for themselves and their best interests, out of fear of losing what power they have. All three are very different, however all end the same way, with V leaving their old life behind to pursue a career as a top mercenary to leave their mark on the city. As well as this, each life path has you run into someone who plays one of the most important roles in the entire game, Jackie Wells. Jackie acts as a catalyst for most of the events that happen in V's story. Without him, there would be no game, as he's responsible for encouraging V to work with him and become partners working jobs for criminals and building up their street cred. Unlike a lot of what CD Projekt Red had shown in the lead up to Cyberpunk, it was nice to see that Jackie actually did make it into the final game. It's just a shame his fate was spoiled well over a year before the game came out. Eventually you and Jackie start to get noticed more and more by fixers, people who set you up with jobs, and you start to get more gigs, jobs. This eventually leads you into the crosshairs of Dexter DeShawn, a notorious fixer who sets you up with a job that if completed will shoot you and Jackie straight to the top. And of course, Jackie and V lap it up until the day they finally have to face the music and steal a piece of experimental tech that belongs to the most unforgiving corporation in the game, Arasaka. The situation soon goes south when Saburo Arasaka, the founder of the company, shows up and gets strangled by his son, Yorinobu Arasaka. The two of you escape from your pursuers and make it back to Dex with the chip intact, but at a heavy price. Once revealing you have the chip to Dex, you realise he is a massive dick, and he kills you.
A quiet life after all. No blaze of glory for me.
No, there's no fucking point. I mean,
Just kidding. After believing you just died, you begin to see strange visions of a life that isn't yours. Little does V know at this point, however, that they are watching the memories of late rocker boy, freedom fighter, terrorist, Johnny Silverhand, in his final hours when he blew up Arasaka Tower. After finding medical aid from your friend and Ripperdoc, backstreet doctor who works on body modification, you realise that the chip you planted in your head for safekeeping didn't just have someone's shopping list on it, but a complete personality construct of Silverhand burned into it. And although the chip in a way is responsible for bringing you back to life after a bullet to the brain, it is now slowly killing you, rewriting your consciousness and replacing it with that of Johnny's. This entire segment is pretty much the prologue of Cyberpunk, so the rest of the game revolves around V and Johnny trying to find ways they can separate from each other before the Prior dies. V goes to great lengths to prevent this from happening by travelling around Night City, making new allies and seeking out any information they can, whilst Johnny is rattling around in their head, piping up whenever he gets the chance. V at this point knows the score in Night City and has to rely on their social skills to get what they need.
Did you forget something?
This is when the game truly kicks into gear, as the plot pushes you deeper into the heart of Night City, unlocking secrets that could send you in the right direction, or a dead end. Some parts of the story can at times feel like they are going nowhere. Specific plot threads will drag whilst others will be brushed over too quickly. It gets to the point where you feel like you aren't getting any closer to fixing V, but this is essential to the character of V. V's narrative is very much based around the idea of not giving up when you're down, to always get back up on your feet, and find a new way around a problem, whatever that may take. Another huge factor that affects V and their story is Johnny Silverhand himself. When you are introduced to Silverhand in his first flashback memory thing, he comes across as an overconfident, violent maniac who only seems to look after himself. Johnny reinforces this almost immediately when he threatens to take your life. In the beginning of the game, he is portrayed in a very antagonistic way, insulting V regularly and making them self-doubt their decisions, kind of like a psychotic version of Jiminy Cricket. V, and also we as the player, see Johnny as this opposing force who stands against V's character and morals. V has just witnessed his best friend die for this chip, and what do they get out of it? A brain tumour who won't shut the fuck up.
You're starting to remind me of me, 50 years back. Minus the charisma. An impressive cock.
As the game progresses, the player has some freedom as to where V's and Johnny's relationship can end up through the dialogue options they have. During key moments in the story, Johnny will talk to V about what possible outcomes may occur. Whilst it could be argued that most of these interactions don't have impact on the endings of the game, and therefore aren't really necessary to the experience, I believe each time V and Johnny talk to each other is for a good reason. Whilst V has set motives, goals, and personality traits, they act as a portal for us as the player to enter Night City, and so we can print out different emotions and reactions onto V depending on the situation, meaning we are the ones talking through V to Johnny, allowing players to show how they feel towards the character. If players want to agree with Johnny, then they can, or maybe if they want to call him out for being a dick, then they can do that too. This makes the relationship between Johnny and V feel a little more natural, or at least tricks you into thinking that by giving those dialogue options. Whether the player likes it or not, V and Johnny begin to rub off on each other, revealing things at the beginning of the game both would have rather died than spilled to the other. Johnny begins to seem more like a human than a migraine, and this process isn't suddenly dropped onto the player. It feels like a natural progression of someone who has trust issues, finally letting go a little, and as a result of this, the player can either choose to accept this new Johnny or remain closed off. Whilst yes, this dialogue can't really affect the conclusion of Cyberpunk, towards the end of the game the player is presented with options that can drastically impact how V's story comes to an end, which I will continue to talk about in a later segment. Before we can cross this bridge, I just want to dedicate some time talking about side quests and some key characters. Whilst V's/Johnny's story can be described as the most important to the narrative, what I loved about Cyberpunk was that most of the characters in the universe had their own stories. Like most open world games, Cyberpunk has plenty of side quests that, depending on your outlook, can either inflame your enjoyment of the game's universe and give you extra pleasure through things like characters and unique plot threads, or can just be something to ignore. It feels wrong labelling some of these side quests due to how significant they are in terms of world building and character growth, but they don't technically have to be completed for you to be able to complete the game. Whilst this could be seen as a positive for those who just want to speedrun the game, it means that more people are likely to skip past some of the greatest moments available in the game. Technically speaking, there are two types of side quests in the game. The side quests that I think are important are narratives that started in the main story, but then splinter off into their own offshoots that focus more on the characters they stemmed from. A lot of these missions are so great because it lets players who enjoyed certain characters and the lives they had made for themselves in Night City go deeper into their specific stories and see the relationship between V and these characters grow. These missions centre around characters you meet in the main narrative of the game, characters who don't seem important at first, but if their missions are pursued, can impact V's life greatly. Before I talk about these missions, I think first I should probably talk about the characters of Cyberpunk, as they are the reason the story and world of Cyberpunk is so enjoyable. Many of the characters feel well thought out with unique roles, goals, and morals, and it never feels like personalities are used twice for characters. Some view the city as a dreamland with opportunity around every corner, whereas others wish they had never come in the first place. Let's kick things off with Jackie Wells, the guy responsible for V getting into the line of murking. Like I said earlier, Jackie is one of the most important characters in the game, but for me that wasn't what made him so special. Jackie was presented as a family man who cared deeply about the people he loved, including V. Loyalty was at the top of his list, shown to go to hell and back with V. For the little time we had with Jackie as the player, the absence of him in the rest of the game could be felt throughout, within the characters that knew and loved him, and it seemed to hit V the hardest. It's not often a character so underused leaves such a huge hole. From the entire prelogue of the game, he is probably the thing most people take away from it. Having lost such a close friend, V's only option is to find people who can help him and Johnny. Two people who help V every step of the way are Victor and Misty, who are both introduced to V through Jackie. Victor is a popular Ripper doc in Night City, and throughout the prelogue offers you discounts to help upgrade your internal arsenal. Victor is often overlooked, which is strange considering his role in the game. It's thanks to Vic that you got Deshaun's bullet removed from your skull, and it is Vic who tells you about the ticking time bomb that has been lit inside of your brain. Without him, V would be none the wiser, and would have just randomly flatlined 2 weeks later. He is a huge fan of boxing, shown through him often watching fights on his TV, and even appears in the final segment of the Beat on the Brat quest, which involves V fighting the boxing champion. His passion for boxing is highlighted in his beliefs and mentality, as when V is at his lowest, he pushes you to carry on, but at the same time he is a realist and always gives you the straight answer, even when it's something you probably don't want to hear. Misty, on the other hand, tries to see the positives in everything. Misty is also another character I feel doesn't get the credit she deserves in the game, considering her interactions with V. She was Jackie's girlfriend and understands the pain V is going through, but despite this, she still tries to reassure them, explaining that Jackie is still part of them. Misty is a very spiritual person. In fact, tarot cards and Misty play a huge role in the game, unless of course you skipped over the Fool on the Hill side quest. V faces a lot of inner turmoil and struggle throughout the game, wondering if anything can truly be done for their condition. Misty comforts V, suggesting that everything is happening for a reason, and that you and Johnny are on a set path to help you cope with this stress. She suggests that several walls around Night City have meaningful tarots graffitied onto them, and that once you find all of them, you can tell her about your findings. Now, whilst running around Night City, finding tarot cards isn't the most exciting task you could be doing, I found this to be one of the more interesting side quests in the game, simply for the ending of the quest, as you realise once you complete the story, or go through for a second playthrough, that a lot of the chatter between Misty and V foreshadows possible events that could happen in the future. After making a ton of new enemies in Arasaka, V realises they have to try and make some new allies to get them out of this very big hole. One unlikely candidate who becomes a close ally of V's is Takamura. Takamura first appears in the prologue as the bodyguard of Saburo Arasaka, and the game makes you believe he will be an antagonist when he finds you at the landfill, believing you to be the person who killed his boss. But what you don't know is that he knows you know who really killed his boss.
You and me figure
Are you with me? Seeing as how Takamura and V now have a common enemy in Yorinobu Arasaka, they decide to work together to find anyone who can help V and try to persuade Yorinobu's sister Honoko about his deception. Takamura is very much a fish out of water in Cyberpunk, as he went from being a respected member of a corporation to a wanted criminal lying low in the rough parts of Night City, and the game perfectly captures his frustration with his new lifestyle. Being a corpo for so long, he doesn't really understand how the streets operate, and so V acts as his guide in some cases, taking him to fixers and helping him with reconnaissance. Although at first you see him as an enemy you have to work with, you begin to see him let his guard down to you and open up about his past, growing up in the slums of Japan. Takamura is also a very spiritual person, believing even after death, spirits still watch over you. The guy even labels a cat he finds a spirit, proving the theory that in the future, people will believe cats are gods thanks to their influence on our culture. He also acts as a calm voice of reason to V, which is a welcome change in Night City, full of loud and at times obnoxious people who love the sound of their own voice. Takamura was probably one of my favourite characters from the entire game, and ultimately is one of the most important characters, as he is involved in many key events in V's story. Whilst he himself doesn't have any side missions to follow, he can appear in one of the game's endings. What makes Takamura such a great character as well, is that he gives insight into the mind of a corpo. Whilst yes, you can technically get some insight into corpos if you pick the life path, most of the time they are just presented as being greedy and bloodsuckers who have no loyalty. Takamura's morals are built on loyalty. Arasaka gave him a job, a place to stay, and food when he had nothing else, else, and suggests corporations like Arasaka work hard to bring peace, whilst mercenaries like V try to tear it down. It's nice to have a game where the line between good and evil is blurred, and really depends on your sense of reason. That's what many great characters in this game do. They make you think and question what is happening around you, and what it means to live. Take Panam for example. Panam is another important character that can impact V's story greatly. You first encounter Panam during the main story, when you help her do a job for a popular fixer called Rogue, who resides in a club called the Afterlife. When you first meet Panam, she is quick to judge and easily annoyed, complaining about you tagging along, but V has to endure a good 20 minutes of sarcastic back chatter in order to find the man responsible for designing the chip Johnny is imprinted on. It is revealed that Panam belongs to a nomad clan, or rather did, before she decided to try and make it big in Night City, and because of this there is some friction between her and the leader of her clan, Saul. Of course, if you have picked the nomad life path, you are able to relate to Panam and her struggles with her family. If you choose to follow her story further, she begins to embrace her nomad heritage, and returns to her clan, often leading to her butting heads with Saul over their opposing visions of what their clan should be.
Be about 2.
Stop it! Fuck! Just shut up already!
Following her story gets V integrated with the many members of the clan, staging heists for new tech and helping break Saul out of captivity. As she begins to shift into more of a leadership role, you begin to notice inner conflict within her. While she is determined to lead the Aldecaldos, her nomad clan, at the same time she doubts herself and her own capabilities, but is reassured by her clan members and V if you choose to go down that road. This is basically what her character represents, this idea of family and not facing anything by yourself, telling V that they never have to do anything alone, ever again, which is highlighted in one of the game's endings. Plus, male V gets to date her, so that's a bonus. The game has a great variety of characters who have lived in Night City for most of their lives, and know the dangers it poses, and others who aren't yet accustomed to its tight grip. Judy falls into the first category. We are first introduced to Judy in the main story through another character called Evelyn. In order to help V with the relic heist, they need to understand the place where the relic will be stored, and so we end up at Judy's workshop to watch a brain dance, which is essentially a bunch of digitized memories. Judy is part of a gang called the Moxes, a group that tend to stick to themselves and very rarely interact with outsiders in order to keep each other safe. We learn this very early when being introduced to Judy, as she is skeptical about this whole operation. This all takes place during the prologue, and you don't see Judy again until after the heist. Judy's trust issues continue to blossom, as once you go back to her workshop, she's quick to dismiss you once you start asking where to find Evelyn. Judy is very protective of Evelyn, as they both fell into the Moxes at an early age, and don't have any family in Night City apart from each other. Judy's fierce love for Evelyn kind of reflects that of V's and Jackie's. Each pair has one person trying to make their lives better, whilst the other is a little skeptical, but nevertheless helps them out in any way they can, and both end very tragically. In many ways, Judy sympathises with V the most, as both had someone who they trusted greatly snatched away from them. Judy's character acts as an example of what Night City actually does to most people. Whilst many newcomers see it as a busy place with lots of opportunity, many people there lose more than they gain. She realises this, and at the end of her story, rather than remain there like a rat in a cage, she decides to leave the city and start a new life for herself. This was a great revelation to V and their character, as it sort of opens their eyes to the idea that the city for most people is a cesspit, constantly bringing new bodies just for them to die to gang violence or poor living conditions. All of these characters are important to V and impact them in different ways, but there are also characters that hugely affect Johnny as well, like the fixer I mentioned earlier called Rogue. She knew Johnny back in the day and was part of the team that helped him bomb Arasaka 50 years before the current events of the game. She's worked hard to get to the top of the food chain in Night City, and after 50 years of peace, has Johnny Silverhand come walking back into her life to flip it upside down. Realising Johnny is alive obviously takes a toll on her, no surprise there. Dead ex-boyfriend comes walking back into her life inside the head of a baby-faced mercenary would make you question everything twice for the rest of your life. Whilst Rogue during the early stages of the narrative isn't really involved too much with the story, she starts to get more character during Johnny's flashbacks and really starts to get into her own during her storyline.
For fuck's sake.
It is revealed that Johnny and Rogue had a complicated relationship in the past, as whilst Rogue wanted things to get serious between the two, Johnny was too blinded by his own goals and rockstar lifestyle to ever see how special she was to him. Johnny, now being forced to take a step back from the wheel, sees now how much of a prick he could be to the people he loved, and so tries his hardest to mend things with Rogue, with V's blessing. This leads to a very awkward date between the two, that ends on a sour note. Things don't have to end there, however, as Rogue's story carries on if you decide to pick a certain ending. Finally, being able to talk to Rogue Rogue had a massive impact on Johnny. He's not the man he once was, and aims to rebuild the bridges he burned. Next on his list is Kerry, an old bandmate of his who is living at large in a mansion after going solo when Johnny died. Johnny's sudden appearance affects Kerry very differently to what it did to Rogue. Johnny's return seemed to haunt Rogue, as if she had tried to block him out after his apparent death, but with Kerry he wastes no time trying to rekindle that spark they had during their samurai days. Samurai was their band name, they weren't weeaboos. Kerry is somewhat of a tragic character, as for the past 50 years he has had to try and work his way out of Silverhand's shadow, always being reminded of his past whenever he releases new music. This isn't to say he hates Johnny, quite the opposite.
Go on here and Johnny! Oh! He's gone, isn't he?
Yeah, but he can still hear you.
Thanks, but not in the mood for hovering tables and voices from beyond the grave right now.
Even though he acknowledges Johnny could be a huge cock, he still saw him as a friend and brings up the idea to get the band back together for one last gig. Kerry has a lot of insecurities present throughout his story. It wasn't easy for him to get to the top, and many people have abandoned him along the way. These insecurities continue when he finds out a popular group called Uzcracks are doing a cover of one of his songs, which infuriates him as he thinks their style of music is the worst. And to be honest, can't say I blame him.
Kill me.
Eventually, with the help of V, he learns to chill out and starts to appreciate the Uzcracks for being inspired by his music. The characters I've mentioned so far all have a huge significance in terms of the narrative of Cyberpunk. Despite not technically being in the main story for very long, their own adventures offer up some of the most entertaining and thought-provoking content in the game. These quests I would consider the most important. However, that's not to say the other one-off quests you come across in Cyberpunk aren't as enjoyable or memorable. This type of genre and world CD Projekt Red created really gave them a lot of freedom to explore some bizarre storylines. Night City is full of many different types of people, some good, some bad, and others are just completely crazy. A lot of the time, these side quests were totally engaging and fun to play, mainly due to the weird and memorable characters they introduced. Many of them tackled a lot of thought-provoking ideas, and didn't refrain from disturbing the player at times. These really showed you just how horrible of a place Night City can be. Like River's Peter Pan quest, where you find several teenage boys who've been hooked up to machines like cattle by a psychopath, or a quest where an ex-murderer decides to repent for his sins by becoming a Christian and offering to be used for a brain dance to sell to the masses. Some of these plots just stick with you thanks to a mix of bizarre situations and great voice performances. Others tackle more philosophical themes, such as what does it mean to be alive, as with the Delamain quest. Some are not so deep and just try to make you laugh, like Skippy the Talking Gun and the guy whose dick is on fire. The game has so many characters that stick in your mind all the way throughout the game, even if they only made a brief appearance. The point is that they are all so memorable thanks to a mixture of great voice acting and bizarreness.
Why not? Considering I'm your new owner.
Increasing volume by 300%.
Involving the narrative parts of the game, the player's actions, thoughts, and emotions are illustrated by dialogue options most scenarios require to progress the game forward. With most interactions the player has with other characters or the environment, they are met with a list of fairly differentiating options that they can use to get dialogue out of the other character and make a choice on how to tackle a specific situation. Important or necessary choices are highlighted in yellow. These options are key to progressing the story forward and often show the player choice, whilst non-impactful dialogue is highlighted in blue, which is essentially extra dialogue the player can pick to find out small amounts of extra information. As I said earlier, the story is the most appealing and interesting part of Cyberpunk, and the dialogue choices are of course a huge factor in this. Whilst there isn't tons of choice with every interaction, it still successfully creates the illusion of choice. The idea that we are V making these conscious decisions, rather than it really being the game pushing us down one of 3 or 4 paths. Now, although the game does implement a lot of moments that are based around choice, and the outcomes that sprout from those choices, it would have been nice to have a little bit more of that. Whilst the dialogue is great for the most part, some of it does feel inconsequential to the overall story, and I just think perhaps implementing a choice system like that found in Telltale's games, where characters remember certain things you said to them earlier on, would have possibly worked out a lot better. This would have been great to see, and could have played a part in the relationships you have with other characters, like maybe your love interests, or Johnny for example. Like I said though, what does help is the amount of options of dialogue you can choose, and it's fun going back on a second or third playthrough to see what other outcomes you can come out with. The endings are of course heavily influenced by your decision making, and this fork in the story is where the game really feels like it's in your hands. Despite the game very much being narrative driven, at its core the game is an open world explorer. Excusing the limitations such as time of day and boundaries, the player is free to take a look around Night City at their own pace, doing as much or as little as they like. If the player doesn't want to do any missions or side quests, there are other smaller gigs they can do to help pass the time and earn rewards. Throughout the game you will get calls from fixers giving you small jobs to perform for their clients. These gigs can just be simple one-offs like stealing precious items or finding out how someone was killed, whilst others, such as the Cyber Psycho gigs, which require you to take down individuals who have lost control of their minds thanks to the amount of tech in their body, can span over many gigs. The player can also locate gang crime scenes and take them out for the local law enforcement, bagging themselves eddies and any loot the groups may have had in their possession. Whilst these smaller gigs aren't that gripping, they do a lot to help with the world building. Unfortunately, the gangs of Night City are mostly brushed over too quickly in the main story, having only minor appearances in it. That's not to say they weren't welcome appearances. I mean, the part where you meet Maelstrom for the first time was one of the best moments in the game for me, and really helped set the tone for the rest of the story. They also introduced some of the best characters too.
Nah, you talk to me. Name's Dum Dum.
These gigs allow you to interact with the gangs a lot more, seeing how they operate, and how they are all different to one another. Each gang operates in a specific part of Night City, setting up their own outposts and headquarters, giving you plenty of chances to get into fights with them. The city is full of these encounters, which could be considered great, but they are essentially the only side activities you can do. Side activities aren't obviously supposed to be the main pull of the game, they just add some variety, but there are so many gigs that feel copy and pasted, it would have been nice to have some other activities to do. As far as I'm aware, the only other things that you can do that aren't gigs, side missions or story missions is ride a roller coaster with Johnny and own a cat, and that's it. Without these little distractions, there isn't much going on in Night City, which is a shame as it is such a great setting and has so much potential to hold so much more. Yes, the side missions hold a lot of this variety, but it could have been cool to say be able to bounty hunt for wanted criminals and maybe find out who's letting their kids wander around Night City alone. That's child endangerment right there. Seeing as how the game is open world, it makes sense that the gameplay would be suited to match this genre. Before the game was launched, the game was said to have one of the most intricate character customizers to date, which of course got people excited as they were promised they could craft V into looking exactly like themselves, getting them truly immersed in the experience. However, Cyberpunk's actual character customization is pretty average, honestly. Yeah, they offer up some strange features like cyberware for V's face and some weird pupil options, but it very much stays on a safe path, not letting the player venture too far outside of the typical skin colour, hair colour, nose type, jaw type, etc. Whilst not bad, it was obviously disappointing for some people. I can also say I too was somewhat disappointed with the feature. How am I supposed to get fully immersed in the game if there isn't an extra small penis option? The most important thing to take away from Cyberpunk's customization is the skill tree. Once you finish designing your cyber sona, you are given the option to put points into skills. These skills being body, intelligence, reflexes, technical ability, and cool. Throughout the game there are two forms of progression, street cred and player level. The one I'm going to focus on right now is player level. Things like completing missions, gigs, or just simply shooting up some gangbangers can give you XP, obviously in varying volume. With each level of progression you receive two types of skill points. Blue skill points allow you to upgrade a type of skill group that unlocks more specific skills for you to spend yellow skill points on. These groups of course have skills within them that cater to different attributes the player can utilise, one example being body. The body skill tree grants the player access to physical skills that can help them in terms of physicality during combat. Intelligence allows the player to perform quick hacks more effectively by granting the player additional RAM slots and ways to take down enemies without having to lay a finger on them. Cool upgrades help improve the player's stealth, allowing them to move around enemies undetected a lot more effectively. Most of these skill groups grant the player variety in the way they wish to play. If they want to take the fight straight to the enemy, then they will be most suited to further upgrade body and reflexes. However, someone who wants to be more stealthy and sneaky, taking enemies out from afar, would probably want to use cool and intelligence more. It was great to see that CD Projekt Red's idea of variety wasn't just for the story, and that it made its way into the gameplay. Upgrading your skills enough can also impact moments in the story outside of the combat. Some character interactions have bonus dialogue choices depending on what life choice you chose and what upgrade you currently have. Having a lot of skill points in the body allows you to physically intimidate some people and forcefully break open doors. The skill tree was one of the best features to come out of the gameplay, as it just keeps the experience fresh and lets players experiment with different playstyles and techniques. When the game first came out, one of the biggest issues was the combat, mainly due to the fact that it was broken. Enemy AI was terrible, often seeing you through walls, making stealth near impossible. Other times enemies were completely useless, either fading out of existence or just choosing to ignore you. This was definitely my biggest problem with this game. Although I loved the story, I couldn't ignore how terrible some fights were. After many patches to AI behaviour and bugs being flushed out of the game, it does feel like combat has significantly improved. It's not perfect, but it's improved. The other aspect of progression in the game, like I said, is street cred. Completing missions for people and side jobs builds up your street cred. Street cred grants you access to more fixers in Night City who will call you to do jobs for them. Let's take a look at the enemy variety. The amount of different enemies you encounter in Cyberpunk is pretty expansive. Whilst most enemies just do the standard hide and shoot at you, a lot of the factions act and behave differently to each other. Whilst the gangs of Night City will attack you with simple sidearms and shotguns, corpos use much more expensive and heavy-hitting weaponry. This shows a lot of dedication to the craft, as this makes sense in the world of Cyberpunk. Militech and Arasaka are mega corporations, so they have the funds for these weapons. These wealthy factions also offer up some of the more varied enemy types, such as flying drones, heavy weapon experts, and robot foot soldiers that resemble Chappie and the Terminator. Most factions have set enemy types, like snipers. Snipers obviously take position in high places, such as rooftops, and try to kill you from afar. These enemies can be particularly dangerous if you yourself don't have the means to kill them. Not as annoying as these bastards who phase through reality like the Deckers from Saints Row the Third. Some enemies will also use quick hacks against you that deal damage over time, so it's best to take them out first. Despite there being a decent variety in terms of gameplay and the combat, there's not a lot of thought you have to put into most of these fights. To fight these bad guys, you of course need weapons. Weapons can be found or purchased in Night City and vary in terms of stats, grey being the lowest tier of weapon, followed by green, blue, purple, then finishing with orange being the most powerful and rare. The aim is of course to end up with more powerful weapons as you progress throughout the game, as you will eventually realise the pistol you've been carrying since the Arasaka heist just isn't cutting it anymore 20 hours into the game. Guns come in all shapes and sizes: revolvers, shotguns, assault rifles, even pistols that aim for you. This setting really let the devs experiment with what you can use to kill enemies. Melee weapons are also in the game, including things like baseball bats and samurai swords. Body modification is also a huge aspect of Cyberpunk's gameplay. As mentioned earlier, Ripperdocs specialise in modifying the structure of your body. These Ripperdocs can be found all over Night City and offer up a huge array of gadgets you can plant inside yourself, such as improved optics, the ability to double jump, and built-in armour plating to prevent yourself from taking too much damage. Two of my favourite implants are to do with hand-to-hand combat: the Gorilla Fists and the Mantis Claws. Gorilla Fists essentially turn your hands into balls of steel, as you can deal tons of damage with them, knocking out enemies in a few punches. They are also extremely helpful during the Beat the Brat side quest. The Mantis Claws are probably one of the most iconic aspects of the game, as they were featured in many of the trailers and other forms of marketing for the game. These give the player an extended blade coming out of each arm that can cut through enemies. For me, these offered up some of the most satisfying moments, as it just felt great laying into some of the tougher enemies with Gorilla Fists. And the Mantis Blades give you some really cool kill animations. Now this may all sound exciting, but it doesn't come cheap. Well, you can find certain powerful weapons and gadgets throughout the game, but for your first playthrough you most likely won't stumble upon these. Let's talk more about the currency system in Cyberpunk. Eddies are essentially dollars you get from completing missions, gigs, favours, or by selling things. With eddies you can purchase weapons, body modifications, clothes, healing items, and even cars. Cars shouldn't really be a priority, however, as the best cars can be found in Night City for free during the story, and in hidden locations. Eddies are essential for you to build up your arsenal and fight the many enemies located in Night City. Nothing comes cheap, as you will find out with the more effective weaponry. This is where the game starts to feel like a little bit of a grind. Whilst you do get eddies for completing tasks, it doesn't feel like you get much, and so you have to push through hours of the game without any good loot until you have enough to actually buy the good stuff. Not so bad, obviously, because you can find free loot, but this kind of makes the eddy system feel a bit janky. Despite the fact that there is such a vast amount of creativity and choice in terms of combat with the enemy types, weapons, and angle of attack, combat in this game is not perfect. At times it can be very frustrating, which mainly has to do with the enemy difficulty. If you have played the game, you may have noticed that some enemies go down fairly easily, whilst others seem to just sponge countless amounts of your ammunition. This wouldn't be much of an issue, but on your map, gigs and missions are designated with a danger level. This, I'm guessing, works off your own level and equipment you currently have. The problem with it is that not all of the enemies in that area seem to follow this rule. A gig might say moderate danger, but then all of a sudden I find myself chugging countless inhalers because some of the enemies just choose to not die. This just feels like a cheap way of making the game difficult unnecessarily. This can only work if the rule is constant throughout. I've only played this game on normal difficulty, and these sudden spikes have put me off ever attempting the higher difficulties. Like I said in the introduction, the game has had a lot of patches over the months, ironing out many of the problems it had when it launched. Notice I said the word many, not all, in a game that aims to immerse the player in this futuristic, frightening and yet beautiful world. Some parts of the game shatter your immersion in just a few seconds. My two favourites so far have been Tak body blocking this guy during a cutscene, and when Panam decided to become a sonar dish rotating on the tank. Besides the glitches, the other major issue with Cyberpunk at launch was the optimization, the biggest reason people could not play the game on PS4 and Xbox One. The game was so poorly optimized that frame rates could drop below 20 in some cases. Even on a PC, the game was struggling to hold itself together. Heaven forbid you went in a crowded area, you may as well have kissed your system goodbye. Now I'm talking from a PC perspective, so I don't know what the frame rate is like in terms of consoles, but the frame rate has become noticeably better on PC. Whilst yes, it does still drop in crowded areas, the whole experience is a lot smoother, allowing you to really take in Night City all at once rather than piece by piece. This has been the most impactful aspect to making the gameplay of Cyberpunk much more enjoyable. Whilst the story was always a strong element, having that little bit more polish really lets you soak in those details you just couldn't before. Again, not saying it's perfect, but I have to admit CD Projekt Red really wants people to enjoy this game. There are few things Cyberpunk nails perfectly. Whilst the story is engaging and emotional, some parts seem a bit insignificant and rushed. The gameplay, although enjoyable, of course has its issues. Having all this in mind, I still think the game is severely overlooked. Thanks to the disastrous launch, people won't have discovered the game's best features, and the soundtrack is definitely one of its best features. It's been so long since I've heard a video game soundtrack that really stuck with me, and one that I listen to on a daily basis. What I'm trying to say is that soundtracks play a huge part in our enjoyment of these games. They can immerse you, hype you up, and equally scare you. CD Projekt Red clearly cared about this game, and this is highlighted with its soundtrack. Each track has so much personality and fits so well with both the world of Cyberpunk and the characters or themes they are trying to convey. Cyberpunk is meant to reflect a metallic and artificial future, and the music captures this so well. Besides a few tracks, most of the music is heavily electronic, which creates these really unnatural sounds, symbolising of course that everything in Night City is pretty much artificial, even the people who live there. Major props have to be given to these guys: PT Adam Czech, Paul Leonard Morgan, and Marcin Shivalovich. These guys knew the assignment and nailed it. Each piece of music honestly elevates every part of the game. Some of these events just would have not been as effective as they were if the music wasn't there to back up the visuals and dialogue. Like I said, some songs capture the essence of a character terrifically. Take V's theme for example, which can be heard on the title screen of the game. This pretty much acts as a taster for what to expect in the music department of Cyberpunk. Now I know I'm no Anthony Fantano, but I'll try and describe the music to the best of my ability. A flow of heavy beats with a somber cello ever so slightly playing in the background, abruptly ended by these whirling sirens and increase in intensity. This perfectly captures V's seemingly normal life being flipped upside down and having to fight for their life, and those whirling sirens are getting you ready for the danger that is to come. Now let's talk about the most iconic piece of music to probably come out of this game, Johnny's theme, first heard during his introduction into the story. The song starts out slowly, heightening our expectations of what is to come, keeping us in the dark of what is actually about to happen. Then we finally get to the tower where Johnny's fiery personality is unleashed for us to see in all its glory. The music becomes violent and abrupt as we begin to cut down Arasaka soldiers, hyping the player up and letting us know that this guy is a badass. During a brief interval, we again hear a cello playing in the background. This conveys a sense of tragedy to the player, letting us know that this situation does not end well for Johnny. It also gives a sense of tragedy to the character of Johnny. Whilst we do not know it yet, Johnny is full of so much hate and rage to the point where it blinds him and puts those he loves at risk. The cello making an appearance in this track also symbolises the connection between V and Silverhand. These tracks are so layered and meaningful you could pick at any of them for hours. Each of these tracks feels so different to the last, which is great as it makes the soundtrack feel so varied. Like with the gangs of Night City, each gang has its own unique theme which helps them break away from each other. My absolute favourites have to be Maelstrom and Militech because their themes fit them so well. Maelstrom are a gang that have taken body modification to the next level, leaving their bodies heavily mutilated in the process, so their theme is very techno influenced, having many intertwining beats that are partnered with a distorted backing, conveying their loss of humanity and submission to technology. People are probably more familiar with this one as it appears very early into the game when V and Jackie visit Maelstrom to retrieve the Flathead, and when we meet their current leader Royce.
It's all paid off.
Got it. I don't see any fucking brick around here, do you?
God, never gets old. Many antagonists in this game have their own themes, which is a really nice touch. It makes their boss fight encounters feel that much more important. Militech's theme is just so perfect as well. The harsh metal beats resemble something out of an automated assembly line, symbolising their business as a weapons manufacturer. Coupled with the synths gives it such a robotic sound, it's great. Whenever you are in a fight with these gangs, the respected theme begins to play, which not only gives them all distinct personalities, but also gets you hyped for the fight, as most of these pieces of music are just absolute bangers. In fact, these themes go hand in hand with the combat for me, as I find myself starting fights just to listen to the themes again. If music makes you actively want to keep listening to it, then the composers must be doing something right. But I feel like it's hard to say what is and what isn't the original score, because all of the music in the game was made for the game. As well as the background score, the music heard in the actual game is just as important. Take the music of Samurai for example. Samurai was of course the band Johnny played in during the 2000s and 2020s, along with Kerry, Nancy, Denny and Henry. CD Projekt Red could have left the knowledge of Samurai limited for the player, only briefly mentioning it as backstory filler for Johnny, but they decided to go the extra mile and actually include singles made by the band in the game. This does a lot for the world building of Cyberpunk, as we actually get to hear the music Samurai made. Seeing as how Kerry and Johnny wrote most of the music, it again lets us as the player get a read of their emotions back in the day, and how they were so full of hatred and the urge to rebel against corpos like Arasaka. CD didn't have to do this much. They could have just made some snippets maybe, but they went out of their way to make this band feel real, which is why they've now become one of my favourite fictional bands of all time. Many open world games that let you listen to the radio will often use music that was created outside of the game to make the world feel that much more realistic. CD Projekt Red again went the extra mile and asked known artists to make music specifically for the game's radio. Brand new music that fits within the world of Cyberpunk. Stuff like this really keeps the immersion alive, because I know for a fact if I heard Umbrella by Rihanna, then I wouldn't feel like I was in Night City anymore. All of this music feels like it fits into this artificial world, which is surprising with the range of artists they asked to be a part of this project. Ratboy, Run the Jewels, Health, Conrad Old Money, and many more, even going as far as to take on aliases in the game to truly sell the immersion. Grimes too made some music for the game, and even voice acted the artist who made the song, Lizzie Wizzy.
No, I don't believe it. You hear me? Not a single word. You're lying.
Yeah, maybe stick to making music, Grimes. Despite the play area of the game being limited to Night City and the Badlands, the world feels a lot bigger, which is thanks to the world building. CD Projekt Red crammed so much detail into so many areas of this game, to the point where you can't help but even feel the slightest bit intrigued by how everything works, from the fantastical technology to the many businesses and individuals present in the city. It's no secret that we as humans have made huge leaps in technological advancements. I'm not saying we are anywhere near Terminator yet, but Cyberpunk tries to shed light on where these advancements could lead the human race in the far future. With hyper-real themes like technology in the game, it's easy for the player to get lost and confused on what it all means, which is expected. No one can explain how any of this could be physically possible, but that's okay, because the game has its own set of rules thanks to its setting. Things like brain dances and hand links help the player realise just how far from our world this game can be at times, truly giving us a unique experience. CD Projekt Red includes dialogue that kind of helps the player adjust to these rules, simplifying what everything is and means. The game hammers home just how much of a dystopia this future really is. Tall neon adverts are plastered everywhere on every wall, making sure your sight can't escape them. Advertising artificial food and implants perfectly summing up what this world has become. People survive on barely edible food, whilst others blow their money on implants, growing faker and faker with every purchase. Corporations and politicians are trying to hide reality behind a bright neon charade. It's really quite disturbing when you start to realise this. In fact, there is even a character in the game who begs people to save their children from body modification, but surprisingly, no one cares, showing us as the player that this has become the norm now. Despite the flashy images and exciting skyscrapers, it feels like the world of Cyberpunk is dying. As well as what we are shown, news reports can be listened to describing natural disasters happening all over Earth. We can see that there is hardly any vegetation at all, which has just been replaced by mounds of sand and rocks. Despite from a few cats and an iguana, there is no wildlife whatsoever. We even learned that sharks went extinct in 2067, again showing the player just how bad things really are. It also acts as a grim reminder that despite this being a fictional world, these are very real problems that we as humans are currently facing. If we aren't careful, things like this could become a reality. I'm not saying that we'll get cameras drilled into our eyes, but global warming is a crisis we can't ignore. Cyberpunk is constantly trying to show the player how all of this suffering and danger was inflicted by humans. Throughout the game, we learn about the many wars that have taken place in the past through some characters who are veterans of those wars, including Johnny himself. Corpo War is a phrase used several times throughout the game and highlights two of the most potent characteristics of humans: greed and violence. corporations. It suggests that corporations have become so desperate for power and wealth that they are willing to kill for it. Maybe in our future we'll see Disney's own private army finally take down DreamWorks for good. It paints Night City as this lawless, animalistic landscape that has reverted back to the Wild West. Crime and death is so high that citizens have to pay for private care if they wish to actually get treated, making we as the player question why anyone would want to live here in the first place. The ending of a game is often the most important part of that game. It acts as a closure for the story, answering questions posed to the player early on, or perhaps surprises the player with twists, and leaves them with even more questions than before. Some games, however, have endings that make the player think about the overall messages of the game, and what has led up to the conclusion they are faced with. Cyberpunk gives the player the tools to have 6 different possible outcomes. How the player gets to those outcomes can vary. This was the part of the game where freedom really was in the player's hands. Of course, if you completed certain side quests with characters. If you were someone who didn't follow side quests at all and finish the game, then you can only finish the game 3 different ways rather than 6. Let's first talk about the beginning of the end. V and Johnny's journey begins to come to an end once Hanako reaches out to V after you tell her that her father was murdered by her brother. She then arranges to meet with V at a fancy bar called Embers. This section of the game is also referred to as the point of no return, as if you choose to go up the elevator to reach Hanako with side missions still pending, you won't be able to finish those quests, and will instead be forced to push through the end of the game in the final narrative chapter. This is where if you didn't complete certain character side quests, then you will be locked out of getting certain endings. After you speak with Hanako, you will pass out in the elevator and awaken Vic's shop, who then explains to you that this is your last chance to choose your destiny, again reminding the player that there is no turning back. Misty is also there comforting you in what could potentially be your last moments alive, unless you figure something out. She then leads you up to a rooftop overlooking Night City, allowing you to take the city in one last time before you make up your mind, or rather minds. After leaving you alone, you and Johnny begin to discuss what to do next. This is where the different endings occur, and I will be talking about how they are achieved and what they consist of. Let's talk about the suicide ending first. The shortest ending, as whilst all of the other endings unlock more parts to play, this ending cuts things short and ends with you on the roof. In this ending, V decides to throw in the towel, explaining to Johnny that if they try anything else, people will die, so it's best to kill yourself and ultimately Johnny to avoid anyone else getting hurt. It also allows both of them to be aware when they die, which is weirdly wholesome and depressing at the same time. The camera gradually jumps away from V and Johnny, getting further and further to the point where they are no longer visible amongst the skyscrapers of Night City, until... This ending never sat well with me, as it doesn't fit with either V's or Johnny's personality of never quitting. What really hits you in the gut, however, is when the credits roll and you see the characters you were close to leaving you messages on your phone, telling you how much they miss you, how much they appreciated your help, and hoping you are in a better place. Seeing everyone so sad and disappointed made me never want to do this ending again. Whilst yes, not the longest ending, CD still managed to put a powerful message behind it. While suicide might seem like an easy way out to that individual, it only gets harder for the people who cared for them. Now it's time to talk about the other endings. The other endings, I feel, are in their own separate category, as in each of them similar events take place. You storm Arasaka with allies. These allies are determined by which path you take, and fight Adam Smasher. Some endings can only be reached on a single path, whilst others can be reached on multiple. The 2 endings I will be talking about now can only be reached on the Devil path. On this path, you ignore Johnny's advice and go to Hanako for help on removing your chip. Johnny is obviously pissed off with this decision, as he hates Arasaka for obvious reasons. You know, getting his brain melted by them probably means they won't ever be friends. Once you finish your phone call with Hanako, you wait around in Misty's shop and you can choose an option for her to read your tarot. Misty can read your tarot in 2 different paths, and each reading gives a foreshadowing as to what can happen in the future regarding the endings. In this path, Misty reveals the Devil tarot, which she is very freaked out by. Once she realises you are working with the same people who murdered Jackie, she is quick to judge you for being disloyal, perhaps suggesting to you as the player that this wasn't the right decision to make. Depending on whether or not you saved Takamura earlier in the game, he joins you on your quest along with Hellman to help rid Arasaka of Yorinobu and remove the chip from your head. Through this path, you discover that Saburo Arasaka made a copy of his psyche and stored it inside a soul prison called Mikoshi underneath Arasaka Tower. You work very closely with many people from Arasaka in this path, which feels very wrong to me. Throughout the entire experience, you feel like you were doing something morally wrong. This was the corporation that oppressed people for so many years and killed Jackie. This feeling is hammered home when you get plugged into Mikoshi and have one last talk with Johnny, who berates you for what you have done, claiming that you not only betrayed him and your friends, but you betrayed yourself. This path really leaves yours and Johnny's relationship in pieces and makes you think twice about whether you made the right choice.
Shame you chose wrong. Damn shame.
It gets even worse as you wake up on board an Arasaka space station, barely remembering who you are, and caught in a loop of doing various tests. This idea that V has forgotten certain things after the chip was removed symbolises how they have changed as a person for the worse. It's like all those times you were with Johnny have just been sucked away, and now you are just alone, going mad in the clutches of what should be your biggest enemy. You start to feel trapped in your small boxed room, bleached of all colour, but this time you have no escape plan, no help, no Johnny. Just you. V's sanity begins to deteriorate day by day, and the choice you made is quite clearly haunting V.
Several weeks tensions between Arasaka Corp and Militech.
Earlier I briefly mentioned how the Fool on the Hill side quest foreshadows the endings of the game. This idea of fate is heavily focused on this path specifically, almost as if the devs themselves are trying to tell you that this wasn't the best decision. Eventually you are awoken by either Hellman or Tak, who explain to you that they have bad news. The operation was a failure, and you will be dead by winter. This is where the path splits into two different endings. You are met with the option to have your psyche pulled out of your head and put into Mikoshi until they find you a new body, or you can go back to Earth and live out what little time you have left. Agreeing to the first one seems like the truer ending to this path, as at this point V has become selfish, not caring about loyalty to friends, and only wanting to live. However, I feel the other ending is a little bit better, as it lets players redeem V, and I guess themselves, going back to Earth and never interacting with Arasaka again, but both are equally heartbreaking in a way, as there is no happy ending. Remain trapped in a soul prison for who knows how long for, or admit you were wrong and return home defeated. Both are pretty shitty. The next ending I want to talk about is the Sun ending, which can be reached two different ways. The first and most popular way is through asking Rogue for help. During this path, Johnny takes control of V's body and visits the afterlife, asking Rogue to bust him into Arasaka Tower one last time. Rogue reluctantly agrees and helps her old friend try to save V's life. On their way to Arasaka, Rogue begins to get emotional. Although she doesn't say much, you understand that this must be a lot for her, going back to face her demons in a sense, one last time. A lot of the visuals we see on the lead up to Arasaka seem to mirror Johnny's introduction, almost as if it's bringing his journey full circle. To many, this feels like the truest one to take, as it involves Johnny essentially getting revenge on Arasaka, and Rogue is able to face off against Smasher one last time, however dies in the process. The other way of getting this ending is via the Don't Fear the Reaper path. This path requires you to do two things. One is to have a strong relationship with Johnny. The other is to cycle through the other options and then wait for 5 minutes. This will trigger new dialogue from Johnny, where he suggests you and him could storm Arasaka Tower solo on one last mission together. This path, without a doubt, is the most difficult one to take, not in terms of emotional difficulty, but actual in-game difficulty. The enemies you encounter down this path are extremely hard to kill and deal high amounts of damage, so it's best to reach level 50 and get some good weaponry because you're going to need it. Dying at any point on this path results in you getting the suicide ending, again reinforcing the fact that this path is pretty much a suicide mission. Depending on which path you took, you will either awaken Mikoshi as V or Johnny. Regardless, you both start discussing what to do next, when Alt bursts in and explains that V has become an engram, just like Johnny, and their body has now reconstructed itself to accommodate for Johnny, viewing V as the intruder. Finding out this revelation genuinely shocked me at first. In this split instance, it felt like everything that these two had worked so hard to achieve was all for nothing. From this point on, the player can take one of two options: either return to your body as V, or let Johnny keep your body. The only path that doesn't have this choice is the Devil path. The outcome for this choice depends once again on the path that you took. In this case, it is the Sun ending, which has V become the #1 merc in all of Night City. With little time left on Earth, they aim to pull off the biggest gig of all time by blasting off into space and breaking into the Crystal Palace, an orbiting space station, cementing their status as a legend of Night City. This ending is great as it kind of rounds off Jackie and V's relationship nicely, as you fulfill his dream of becoming famous mercs in the afterlife, who will be remembered to the end of time. This ending also feels like CD Projekt Red is telling us to live our lives to the fullest, taking in every day as our last, because after all, we don't truly know how long we have left on Earth. The next ending I'm going to be talking about can only be reached via one path, the Star ending. This ending can only be reached if you have completed all quests with the Aldecaldos, which are the nomads you meet with Panam. Choosing to ask them for help will have Panam come and pick you up and transport you back to her camp, where she, Saul, and the other Aldecaldos propose a plan to fight their way to Arasaka, with a tank you helped them steal in an earlier mission. Before setting off on this dangerous journey, you are made an official family member of the Aldecaldos. Once the sun rises, you and the gang roll out towards Arasaka, across the Badlands, taking out any resistance you come across, and losing a few friends along the way. Eventually, you break your way into Arasaka, and as expected, face off against Smasher. However, Saul is killed during the fight. The events with Mikoshi, Johnny, and Alt are all pretty much the same. You are again met with the choice of returning to your body or giving it to Johnny, but of course to reach this ending, you must return to your body as V. You awake to a view of Night City with Panam standing beside you, telling you that this is probably the last time you will see it again. Whilst you are still critically ill and have little time left, in this ending, V is a little more optimistic that they will find help outside of the city. Setting off under the cover of a storm, you break away from all the noise, pollution, and desert, and are met with a starry night where the moon has never been so clear. You bid your old life farewell as you, along with Panam, set out to start anew. This was probably my favourite ending out of the bunch, as to me it makes the most sense on what should be done in that situation. After all the time V has been in Night City, all they have faced is danger and death around every corner, and ultimately it was proved that the city doesn't have all the answers. It pretty much just sucks the life out of the people who live there, and those who stay too long will never be able to leave at all. So in order for V to actually live, they have to leave the place that started all this pain and grief in the first place. Plus you get to spend the rest of your days with Panam, which doesn't sound so bad, honestly.
Well?
It's perfect. All great, Panam. We're going home.
The ending I have saved till last is probably the most powerful ending in the game, especially if you as the player have grown fond of Johnny Silverhand over the course of the game, the Temperance ending. This ending can be reached through 3 of 4 paths, and is achieved by V coming to terms with their imminent death and allowing Johnny to return to their body, whilst they go with Alt to become something greater, along with the other souls trapped in Mikoshi. Despite this path being reachable in 3 different ways, one of them feels a little bit scummy, which is through the Rogue path, as it feels wrong persuading V to give up their body, despite Johnny agreeing to give it them back. The decision should really be up to V, and it makes it a much more emotional farewell this way. If V gives up their body, then we awaken a small apartment, now playing as Johnny. In this ending, Johnny is very quiet and seems to be keeping to himself, which is probably because he feels guilty for what happened with V. Can't say I blame him. It is then revealed that Johnny has made friends with a kid called Steve, who he has been mentoring, teaching him how to play the guitar and helping him rise up against his abusive father. Steve gives Johnny a lift through Night City, and without the threat of Arasaka or any of his other enemies, he realises how beautiful the city can be, in a way regretting that he never took the time to look at all the finer details. After buying a new guitar, he heads to the future equivalent of a graveyard and pays his respects to the person who gave everything up to give Johnny a second chance at life. Johnny then gives Steve his axe and leaves Night City on a bus to a destination we are unaware of. This ending does a lot for the character of both Johnny and V. With V, it shows the selflessness and bond they have with Johnny. Losing Jackie was bad enough, and now they can't face letting another good friend die, so give up their life to save another. This ending also highlights how far Johnny as a person has come. For most of his life he has been this selfish and rage-filled ball of fire, looking for the next person to hurt or rebel against, but not being able to do anything whilst locked inside V's head gave him a chance to take a step back. V's sacrifice also showed Johnny not to take his life for granted ever again, as he was literally given a second chance, and he'd be damned to let that go to waste.
Haven't forgotten a thing. Never will.
Each one of these endings, besides the suicide ending, has deep connections with tarot cards and this idea of destiny. Whilst Misty's tarot readings and Fool on the Hill quest could have been just some filler, it just makes the narrative that much more intriguing, seeing that these seeds, which were planted so early in the story, would be involved in the conclusion of Cyberpunk. CD Projekt Red really messed up releasing this game when they did, as rightfully people didn't want to play a broken game. This is painful to say, as many of these great moments and experiences I had in this will not be experienced by many people, because they've already had their fingers burned once, and it's honestly not their fault. It's so irritating seeing how good this game is, but knowing how much it could have been with a little more time. Hopefully CD doesn't give up on this game, because there is still so much to tell in this universe. Whilst yes, they did make a roadmap for the game a while back, that has clearly gone out of the window, but I'm kind of glad that it it did, because they need to fix the base game as much as possible before daring to charge people for broken DLC packs. Hopefully some of you watching feel the same way, and have played this game for yourselves, just for the story and characters alone. Although it's not the greatest gaming experience, the hard work from the story writers, concept artists, voice actors, and the composers should be commemorated, and they deserve to have their glorious creations seen.
Goodbye, and never stop fighting.